All right. So a quick review of equity. We've all heard the definitions. We've seen all of the little graphics that are out there with kids, right, at the baseball field or at the apple tree. But we know that equity, the basis of it is that we're focusing on um, justice and fairness and creating environments that are centered in justice and fairness. It's not about the state of affairs. It's about looking at our structures, looking at our systems, and embedding equity minded principles, social justice, and fairness, embedding them and centering that work in our structures and in our systems, and doing it in a way that not only can it be achieved, but it's something that can be sustained. So we talked last week about equity, looking at it like a pie, right? If we are thinking in terms of someone is taking slices of my pie, someone, those other groups, last week we talked about othering and belonging, those other groups are taking from us and they don't share our values. Um, so this is about making sure that everyone has exactly what they need. Um, Making sure that they have the ingredients to make their own pies, right? So that we don't have to, quote unquote, worry about them taking ours. But we know that that's a mindset that doesn't belong in environments that are centered in equity and inclusion and belonging. So we also looked at this definition of equity mindedness from Q, and how we're in our work having that willingness to look at ourselves, right? And our institutions. One of the things that I like to mention is that oftentimes when we think of equity, particularly as educators, when we think of equity, we think in terms of, well, it's the students need equity. The students need for us to be equity minded. The students, the students, the students. And yes, that's true. But what sometimes we fail to understand is that equity is about us, right? Who are we and how are we showing up and how are we walking in the world? And how are we showing up in our environments, in our work environments, or in our classrooms? Um, but equity means taking personal responsibility, but also not only applying a lens to who we are, but applying that equity lens to the systems that we engage with and with our institutions as well. And being critical of that, having a critical, equity minded lens, but equity for me is always centered in love. So we're doing this work because we love our students, because we love our institutions, because we love what we do as educators, regardless of our positions within the institution. We're all educators, whether we're on the instruction side, whether we're on the student services side, student support services, whether we are administration, regardless of our positionality, it's about the love of the profession, the love of being an educator, and who are we and what can we bring to the institutions and to the students that we serve. So being equity minded means using evidence when we're examining our practice. It means being race conscious, not being color blinded. It means that it's institutionally focused, systemically aware, and equity advancing. If I'm moving too fast, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me. So let's talk a little bit about your equity journey. You've been doing a lot of work. We talked about this last week. But one of the things that also came up was this gap between ideas and ideals and implementation, right? There was some talk around that. We know that this is the work that we say that we're doing. We know that this is the work that we're engaged in, but we haven't even really gotten to how do we know it's working? It's where can I see it in what I do on a day-to-day basis, right? So that came up, and I wanted to circle back to that because I think that's an important question. And I think it's something that we all have to take into consideration, sit with that, and really think about that. Like put some energy around that. We know what our mission statement says. We know what our vision is. We know what the goals are. We know all of these things with respect to the institution, as well as with respect to equity. So the SMC equity mission focuses on upholding an equitable learning and working environment. And I highlighted the equitable learning and working environment because that came up last week, where folks felt like, well, yeah, we say that we're doing this, but how does it apply to us? Number one, in our positions, right? How does it apply to us? But also, where do we see this in action with respect to our students, right? So how does it apply to us in our working environment? Where do we see that applying to us? And also, where do we see this applying to our students? How can we really show that this is the work that we're doing? How is it being demonstrated? Always goes back to where the rubber hits the road, right? Boots on the ground. People can sit in offices and come up with concepts and theories of how things should be done and what that means. But we also know that it might be different in our classrooms. It might be different in our offices. So we're told we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to be equity minded, whatever that means, right? We need to have compassion. We need to be student centered, right? But what does that mean when I'm in a situation in the moment and it doesn't seem like it's going well? I'm not connecting with the student. Student might be asleep in my class, right? Or the student might be upset or irate about something. And so what does that mean? What does equity mean in that moment? Because that's where we have to start looking at the application of all of these theories and concepts and what does it apply in, how does it apply in the moment, and what does it mean for us? So I think that these are some questions we need to, consider and keep in mind as we move through the work, because I think that for the most part we're equity minded. We know this, but sometimes in the moment, it might be a bit challenging to access all of these theories and these concepts and these, what are we supposed to do in the moment? And how are we supposed to be in the moment? So I think it's important for, again, for us to consider this. And also with the equity vision, upholds the values of equity, inclusion, and social justice as a pathway to personal and academic excellence. What does that mean? But more importantly, what does it mean to you personally when you are in the moment, in your jobs, now in Zoom 24/7, it seems like. I feel like I am never without my computer, and I'm feeling anxiety when I'm away from it because I feel like there's something that I'm supposed to be doing, or there's something that I'm not doing, or there's an appointment that I'm supposed to have, or there's, so the Zoom fatigue is real. Yet this is where we are right now in society. So the question becomes, how can we sustain this work that we're doing? But how can we ensure that we're bringing our full selves to the moment? And then what does that mean when we're exhausted, when we're overwhelmed, when we're tired, when our voices are giving out? How do we keep this going, and how do we maintain Our commitment to equity. How do we maintain that when sometimes we may not just be feeling like that in the moment? So, what does that mean for us? Again, questions that I'm asking for us to consider as we move through the work. Let's look at your framework. Wonderful framework that focuses on, have you all seen this? I'm assuming that you have, right? I'm assuming that you already know what your equity framework is, but just in case, I'm going to go over it. All right. So the main things that are lots of course, the document is vast and wide, but it has some great bullet points in terms of the work that's being done by the institution. And so, with respect to your framework, you're focusing on authentic communication, cultural humility, high impact anti-racist practices, change management, and culturally responsive facilitation. Those are some of the high points, right? The work that you're doing. So what does authentic communication mean, right? So in your framework, it speaks to how will we address conflict, misinformation, microaggressions, and unintentional wounding? How will we ensure students are heard and respected as partners in this process? And in what ways and in what spaces can the modeling of authentic communication begin? What active steps can be taken to model this behavior? How will we ensure all voices are heard? And how will community agreements and norms be embedded in our interactions? I think that's a great place to start with authentic communication, as well as cultural humility. What assumptions are we making about our work environment? What cultural dynamics are we looking to challenge or center? What are we challenging or centering? How will we disable power imbalances? Right? And then high impact anti-racist practices. Seems like it's moving from being equity minded. It went from um, uh, um, inclusion to, well, diversity to, no, even before that, integration, right? Integration to diversity to inclusion. And now we're looking at being anti-racist. And we know everyone's reading the book and the different work that's out there around anti-racist practices. So how do we do that? Because it's more than just what we're reading in books. How are we applying this information that we're learning? And how are we applying it on a daily basis? And then also change management and culturally responsive facilitation. Who's best prepared to facilitate these equity-focused meetings? And how are the facilitators supported? So a lot of these questions that we have. And we're also calling in versus calling out. I know you all have done some work around calling in versus calling out as well. So just looking at the gist of your framework, right? Authentic communication, cultural humility, high impact anti-racist practices, change management, and culturally responsive facilitation. But I really want to focus in on the authentic communication and cultural humility. What does it mean to be authentic in your communication? And who gets to do that, if anyone? It's interesting that, we're all having to wear masks these days, right? But in actuality, we've been wearing them all along, especially when we go into, right? Especially when we go into our work environments. Because we know that there are power dynamics in place. And we know that if we say what we may really be thinking in the moment, if we honor who we are in the moment and how we feel in the moment, that might mean we may not be able to eat next month or have a roof over our heads, right? Or pay our children's tuition. So how do we, look at this with an equity lens, with a critical eye? How do we get to a space where we say we want authentic communication and we make that a part of our institutional equity framework? But then how are we ensuring that authentic communication can actually take place? And what does that mean? And do we feel comfortable doing that, even when the institution tells us we're about authentic communication here? Do we feel comfortable? And who feels more comfortable than others? And why is that? So I think we have to look at our environments with a critical lens. And I think we have to be honest about where we are and what this really means. And how do we navigate this? Because if we look at this notion around authentic communication, and especially with what's been happening in society right now, and especially looking at now everyone's doing anti-racist work, it also means that certain members of society are being called forth to now tell us how you feel and what you think and what this means to you. So that's additional emotional labor. That's additional work that we're having to do for the good of the order, so to speak. And so, do we feel comfortable at all times being authentic? Because what happens when we're no longer in crises and looking for strategies to fix everything? Will what we said be remembered? And if so, by whom and how so? So I'm just looking at, what it is we say we're about and what that really means when, the rubber hits the road. Like, how do we apply this? How do we ensure that we're doing this work? Because in order to be student-centered and equity-centered institutions, we've got to get real about this, and we've got to be able to communicate authentically. But we know that there has to be rules around that and ways to navigate that so that we're all okay at the end of the day. And so that brings us to cultural humility, right? How are we doing this work? Again, looking at the power dynamics and understanding that, but how can we kind of flatten that out so that we can all just connect human to human in the moment, so that we can really be about this work and getting it done for us? Because when we're in environments that are supportive, that are equity centered, social justice, right, at the center of it, then we know that that brings a level of engagement to the work that's going to benefit our students. We're happier. I know I am. When I can walk into an environment and be myself, when I can walk into an environment and I can wear my hair the way that I wear my hair without having to be concerned with judgment, when I can just show up as my wonderful Black self, right? But I can be comfortable in my skin and with who I am. And when I'm in that space, my work is on fire. And my commitment to my work is deepened, and I'm excited about it. But also, I'm excited about helping our students get to this place where they're comfortable in their skin, where they know that they're learning along the way and they're trying to figure it out, but they also know that they're supported by people who are concerned about them and who genuinely care about them and who really want them to succeed. And even though I might be exhausted, even though I might be just tired, can't respond to another email, whatever the situation may be, I'm going to go back to my why. Like, why am I an educator? Why am I doing this? Right? And that's going to propel me to jump right in there and help my students. So, again, looking at this, how can we be authentic? Not just in communication, but ourselves. How can we bring our whole selves to the work without fear of judgment or backlash? How can we be who we are so that we can help our students, assist them with being the best that they can be, and help them forward their lives? Because that's what we're here to do. We're here to change lives. We're here to transform lives. We know our demographics, right? We also know you all are in Santa Monica. The student demographic doesn't necessarily reflect um, the community, right? So we know that there's a difference there. So the question is, how can we help them forward their lives? How can we bring our whole selves, our best selves to the work so that we can help our students reach their goals, forward their lives? Because we know that once that happens, then that's generations down the line. The work we're doing is helping generations down the line. So I'm excited about being a part of that because I remember when someone helped me, because I am also first generation, and I didn't have anybody to look to for this, right? But someone grabbed my hand and said, let me help you out, and showed me. So on to college, I went, then to law school, right? Then practicing law. But along the way, there's always been someone who cared enough about me in that moment, not necessarily knowing me, but caring enough about their work and what they're there to do, their calling, caring enough about that to reach out to help somebody forward their lives. So again, this is the work that we do as educators. I'm excited about it. And that's why, I'm ride or die equity all day, right? So how are we? How are we? And I go back to that question because last week, for some of you that were here, we talked about how John Powell speaks about the little we and the big we in society. Little we focuses on those who are keeping others out of being their full humanity and fully participating in society. So it's the group that others everybody else, like circumstances that allow some to other every. They don't believe what we believe. We think they're going to take our resources. They're dangerous. Whatever it is, whatever the othering is, and all of the isms, right? So Dr. John Powell, out of the Othering and Belonging Institute out at Berkeley, talks about the little we and the big we. And he says that the big we is all inclusive. Everybody gets to be at the table. It's not just that you're at the table though, because we know that with diversity, folks are let in, but they don't have access to everything, right? You can come in, you can even sit at the table, but you get this menu. We've got this other menu over here with everything in it. So we know that there are limitations imposed. So when we're talking about the collective we, that's when we move from inclusion to belonging, where everybody belongs. Everybody has a seat at the table. Everybody gets to eat from the same menu. Everybody gets to select the music that's going to play at the party. It means everyone has access and input, and every voice is valued. So I'm asking the question, how are we? Because I know that last week there was some conversation around, well, we don't always feel that this work applies to us, and we don't always feel that the things that are being done within the institution always applies to us. So I think we need to kind of look at that a little deeper, right? Because if that's what we think, if that's our experience, then what work needs to be done around that? What kind of lens can we apply to this? And how can we make some shifts? And where can those shifts be made? But I think that we need to really look at that and be honest about it, be authentic about that, and communicating what the needs are and what would help you be to feel not even the sense of belonging. Because for me, when I hear this language around, oh, we've got to increase their sense of belonging. Well, for me, either you belong or you don't. It's not a sense of it, because the sense is like, kind of maybe I belong today if I wear the right outfit, if my hair is right. It's I belong, period. They belong, period. So, how do we do this, right? Because I think in order for us to really um, dive into this, there has to be a willingness to have that authentic communication around it, understanding the dynamics that might be at play. But what are you willing to do for what it is that you need in order to feel 100% a part of where you are every day? Just some questions. Maya Angelou said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. I think that's important with respect to us in the academy, right? As educators, but also our students. Because where we are, and again, those power dynamics, when students show up and they need our assistance, how do they feel when they leave us? And we get to set that up. We get to set that up in the moment, but that means being equity minded. Going back to what I said, how are we showing up in the moment, right? Even if I'm completely tired and this student may have some issues that I'm not so sure I can assist them with. But do I know maybe who can? And not necessarily sending them to, I don't know, a link, but how can we hook them up with a person, right? Someone that we also know is equity minded and is supportive of our students. Because we know that we're all still on our journeys and we're all still working to get there. And some of us may be, gone down some roads that some others haven't yet. So we even have to have compassion and patience around that. But it's also our responsibility to know who can we send these students to that will assist them, that will let them, when they leave, they're going to feel good about that experience. We know that changes are being made around how we language things, right? Now it's coming up with, student experience. That's a division in some colleges. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean we're being intentional about the student experience? The whole student? Is that what that means? Or we're just setting linear things in place, hoops for them to jump through so that they can have this experience and move through it quickly in terms of the matriculation process. And that's fine, because that's good work too. But my question is, we've set up these we know the systems do exactly what they are designed to do. So we know if we're setting up systems that students can move through that matriculation process to get them from point A to Z. And we know what that is. Retention, right? Persistence, retention, transfer, graduate, get out there in the world with some skills that make them employable. That's the end goal, right? But what is that experience like for them? How do they feel when they're going through the student experience that we've designed for them? So while we're thinking about the matriculation process and all these, wonderful services that we have set up for them, how do they feel when they go through, when they jump each hurdle and they make it, or when they go through, each area and they get from point A to Z? How do they feel? And are we thinking about that? Because that means that we're bringing a certain intentionality to the work that we do. And so how are we doing this? Just keep coming back to that question. A lot of focus is on the why. We know why we do this, I think, I hope. We love education. We love the profession, right? We want to serve. We want to help students reach their goals. We also want to eat in the process. We want, we want a job. We want benefits. We want all of that, right? It's a part of it, yes. But we love our profession. So we know the why. So now the question becomes, but how are we doing this work? Because that brings a different level of intentionality to the work in the moment. So how are our students doing? We know that it's a lot happening right now, okay? And we know that we're all in limbo right now because just of where we are in society right now. We know what the numbers say, but we know that things haven't shifted yet. So a lot of students are concerned and scared. A lot of students are scared. And just not sure about what's happening. So let's just take a moment. I'm going to stop talking so much. Let's take a moment in the chat. And, feel free to turn on your mics as well and just share out as well. But just how do you think our students are doing? I mentioned that they're scared. Some are experiencing a lot of different things right now. But how do you think what's happening in the moment in time, how do you think it's impacting them? Yes, Michelle.
Well, the students have expressed to us yesterday that if they are hungry and cold and homeless, they can't study.
You just preached the whole sermon. Right?
Yeah.
If they're hungry, what else did they say? Homeless?
And cold, yeah. Then they can't study, yeah. So that's why our food security program is so important. And our homeless, we constantly try to find our students homes. So if they said they cannot study if everything else isn't right.
Mm. It makes sense, right? Makes sense. Anybody else?
I have noticed because I do the food pantry every week. It seems like our students are in these last few weeks given. Sorry, is my internet going out? I keep getting a warning on my
We,
side. Thick lately, which is nice.
one more time, you did go out right in the last part.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, like it seems like students have been a lot more optimistic the last few weeks.
They've been more optimistic. That's
Yeah,
good.
just I mean, the election definitely helped, but yeah, I definitely have noticed that they've just been missed about things.
That's good to hear. That's definitely good to hear. Anyone else? Thanks, Travis.
I think Diana posed a question or comments, as well as Shannon also posted a question in the chat feature.
Can you tell me what the question is?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So what Shannon has, I think Shannon mentioned measures of success are the measures of success, and the question reads, are those measures of success how our students measure success? Which is a fantastic question. Really good question in itself. And what Diana posed was, I think students, I think since we have never experienced before, they're struggling because no one knows how this will end, and that leads to feelings of hopelessness. Absolutely, it's one, like we don't know how this is ending, and we don't know how this is going, so to say. Like if we're supposed to feel these certain emotions these unique ways. So just want to give those comments and questions life.
Thank you. Thank you. Important points. Absolutely. Important points. Education Trust West did a study, and they found that 3 in 4 college students are concerned about being on track to graduate, with concerns even higher for students of color. They're facing severe financial insecurity as a result of the pandemic. Issues around food, housing, as Michelle mentioned. Students say that they don't think they'll be able to afford their basic expenses. They're skipping meals. They're needing our food pantries. Students also mentioned that there are major gaps between their needs and existing supports. And so they're saying it would be helpful, for instance, 85% are saying it would be helpful if they received emergency financial aid or other financial support. And only 31% of schools they feel are doing this that they know about. So there's a gap between what they need and what they know exists for them. So that speaks to what? How is information getting out to our students? How are we messaging students to let them know what's available for them? And what does that look like? Because oftentimes, and I'm not saying that that happens here, because when I look at your website, it's absolutely wonderful compared to so many others within the CCC system. But I also noticed that when we do sometimes set things up that look great, it's just more clicks that students have to get through to get to the service. And so sometimes it becomes this whole maze of how do I even access the information, especially now since I can't go on campus. So, you know, it's important to do digital equity walks within your department to see just how many clicks does it take for a student to get to these services that we offer. And if it's a lot of clicks, we might need to look at that. How can we reduce that? Because that's being equity minded. Because we know, based upon what the data says, students are frustrated. Based upon your own study that was done by Hannah, right? Students expressed all that they were feeling, all that they're contending with, how challenging things are, how challenging times are for them right now. And so when we have processes in place that require a lot of attention, right? A lot of clicks just to get to the information, that's frustrating. That's going to add to more frustration. And then if it's just more words upon more words upon more words, that's frustrating. So even looking at our respective areas, how can we put in little videos, 5 minutes or less, chunk it out so that students can then just watch it very quickly so that there's, it feels like it's a live person communicating what they need to assist them. So, use that equity lens and look at how information is being communicated to your students in your respective areas. And where can you, make some shifts? It might take a little bit of work, but I think we're going to be here for quite some time. We know that in the spring, we'll still be on Zoom 24/7, right? Hopefully by fall of 2021, there'll be some changes made. We don't know. But in the meantime, what shifts can we make? What can we change? What can we chunk out? What can we videotape, right? What can we video? What can we do to make things easier for students to access the information that they need? Because when they can't access it, that's a barrier. That's a barrier to their success. So maybe take a look at this. This is what they say that they need, but they're not so sure about whether it exists or not. So that's on us to figure out how to get this information to them, to let them know we've got the support that you need. We're doing the work to make sure you have what you need to remove your barriers to success. But we've got some more work to do to make sure you know about what's available. Mental health services. We're asking a lot of schools now to make sure that you have online mental health services for students. And if you do have them, know who provides that and have that information readily available, just in case, right, you run across a student who needs it. Because 67% of those students say that their stress is higher than usual. They have anxiety, depression, more mental health issues than they had before. They're concerned about developing substance abuse or addiction during the pandemic. And they say they're living in fear, panic attacks. So we have to make sure that we have not only mechanisms in place to assist our students, but the deeper work is we have to make sure we're in place, right? To make sure students have what they need. And what I mean by that, the head work is there. We know what our jobs are, right? We're great at our jobs. The head work is there. The heart work needs to be brought into the equation. And now, even more so, students need us to be more flexible. They need us to be more compassionate. They need us to be more understanding, but not just with students, we need that with each other. So how are we making sure that our colleagues who are also stressed out, who are also experiencing depression, who are also fatigued, who might be having panic attacks, adjuncts might be looking at food insecurity, whether they're going to have assignments. So we have to look at who we are in the academy as colleagues, and how are we also supporting one another? Because that's part of the equity work as well. Yes, we're going to do what we need to do for our students, absolutely. But, how are we, the big we? How are we doing? That's all of us. So how are we bringing care, authentic care, into the work that we do with one another? As well as how are we supporting our students during this time? Students are saying they're going to need more financial aid. They're going to need more help getting back on track. They're going to need help finding a part-time job and more academic support. How do we even do this when we know employment numbers are the way that they are? How do we do this in career services? Given what students say that they need and what we know that they need, and then we look at the reality of the situation out here, we've got to get creative, I think. We've got to get creative. So for instance, I'll give you an example. We know I also work at Mount San Jacinto College. And one of the things that we're experiencing is, which I'm sure we're not unique, but students may not be able to graduate from certain programs because certain classes can't be offered because of the discipline, right? They need to be in person in order to do this work. So they can't attend class, which impacts them being able to graduate because they need these skills, right, in order to do so and to get a job. So how are we addressing that when we know that, well, we can't be on campus right now because we're in the middle of a pandemic? So how are we being creative, looking for ways that we can pair up with maybe businesses? So one of the things that we decided to do was to pair up with the Chamber of Commerce and other small businesses, have our digital media students pair up with other students, photography, audiovisual, but we got those students together to create a campaign, right? Branding, short videos, so that the Chamber of Commerce can use that for an upcoming event that they're having. That's a virtual event. But it was a way to bring students into the work that needs to be done to make sure that they can meet the requirements for graduation. I just offer that to say that we've got to get creative now because we're in the middle of this crisis, this health crisis. We've got to get creative with respect to how we serve our students. And we know that things work. We've got plenty of evidence of how things have worked in the past and what we have done in the past, but these times require us to step up and be bigger than that, and to dream bigger and to think creatively so that we can continue helping our students meet their goals. Students were saying that they feel disconnected from key campus supports. Sorry, my apologies for this being so small, but again, you'll have access to this PowerPoint. Okay. So how do we help students with that? If they're feeling disconnected from key campus supports, what are we doing to bridge that? Again, this goes back to how are we showing up with the work, right? Empathy is necessary. Some are arguing that compassion along with empathy is needed, of course, but some say compassion is more lasts longer, so to speak, than empathy. Empathy focuses on just the emotions in the moment. Compassion means you're a compassionate individual, and regardless of what the moment calls for, you're going to step up and see that person as human and provide them with what they need. When we're looking at being empathetic, bringing this into the work, how are we listening? What judgments do we bring to the work? What assumptions do we bring to the moment? Again, we've got to get real intentional about how we do this work. So we know that you've heard information around unconscious bias, right? Everyone has it. Everyone, quote unquote, is prejudiced, brings their own prejudices and judgments to everyday occurrences. But are we being mindful of that? Can we, in the moment, assess a situation and determine that we're going to be mindful and present to the moment? We're going to even take a moment to look at what judgments we bring with us about who we're engaging with. And can we suspend those judgments and those assumptions about the person or the situation? Can we listen to them in such a way that it's empathetic listening happening? Can we ask more questions so that we can genuinely find out what it is that they need so that we can support them? And it all goes back to how do we serve others? Because the work that we do as educators, we're in the business of service. So it really goes back to how are we showing up in the work? Again, we know our whys, but let's look at the how are we doing this? So are we doing it with empathy and with compassion? And there'll be links to those videos that you can see when you get access to the information. So how are we showing compassion? What does that look like in the moment? Again, it goes back to being mindfulness, to being mindful. And I know we're all exhausted. Being mindful sometimes is the last thing we want to do because we just need to get through the moment. Being mindful is calling us to do a whole lot more work than we may not even have the capacity in the moment, but that's okay too, because we're human. And so when we're not operating as our highest selves, so to speak, that's understandable. We're human. Again, it goes back to suspending judgment, just understanding that that's going to happen from time to time. But the goal is to just get back up on that equity-minded train, so to speak, right? How do you come back to the work time and time again? How do you be present for the work and for the moment time and time again? It's an iterative process. Just like everything else we do as educators, it's an iterative process. We're going to assess what's in the moment, we're going to reflect, and we're going to, transform. Situations come up, may not be comfortable for us in the moment. Conversations may not be comfortable in the moment. Engaging with others may not be comfortable in the moment. But again, how do we bring our highest selves to the work? How do we show compassion? How do we listen with empathy? How do we suspend judgment? How do we be aware of what each other needs, particularly our students and our colleagues? But that means that there's in the past, there've had to been some interaction, some engagement, where you actually get to, have an authentic moment with a colleague so that you may know what they're experiencing and they may not have the capacity for your demands in that moment. So how do we know when to step back? What are the ways that we engage with each other? And have we had conversations about what these rules are, so to speak. But the goal is bringing compassion and empathy, love and joy to the work and to the moment when you're dealing with colleagues, when you're dealing with students, because it's about the big we. How are we doing? How are we doing? And how are we doing this work? I want to go back to curious listening. Listening with empathy, but also listening with curiosity. Because sometimes we wonder in the moment, is this person even worth listening to? Right? I got so many things to do. I don't even have time to listen to what you have to say. Next, we're in next mode. But how do we get centered enough where we can slow down and be curious in the moment when we're listening, when we're engaging with another human being? Not just a student, because sometimes when we just attach student to it, there are all these other things that come into play with student. Do me a favor, put into the chat some of the labels that I'm sure none of you have said anything like this, but when we're thinking of like deficit-minded labels, words that we use to describe students. I'll give you an example. Students are lazy. Again, you may not have said these things, but you may have heard them, or you may have seen things written in documents, right? Or been in meetings where these things have come up. But what are some of the words or the labels that are used sometimes to describe our student demographics? Because we know it's coded with certain ideas. So again, students are lazy. What else have I heard? They just can't learn. Students are rude. So can you share some things in the chat? And also come off your mics, turn your mics on and let's chat about it. Okay, they don't try hard enough. Cats, herding cats, okay? Won't figure it out. They hate to read, they work full time and are not dedicated.
Hi, Arnita.
Hi, who's speaking?
My name is Carla.
Hi, Carla.
I actually had a conversation. I'm taking some classes right now this semester, and I had a conversation like this with my professor in a breakout room. And so she was mentioning that some students don't know what an outline is in the college setting. And so what I mentioned to her was that it's not their fault, so to speak. It could be also the education they received in K through 12, because as I told her, most of the times kids just get passed along, and it doesn't matter whether they know or they don't know, and sometimes they're embarrassed and they don't want to say it. Or it could also be the educator in the K through 12 setting kind of not wanting to take the time to show them detailed information on how to do it. So it could be a little bit of both. But honestly, for me, it's the education they receive um, in some cases, in a lot of cases, because like I said, I've seen it happen where one of the guys that I graduated with, he still doesn't know how to read, and we're 40 years old. So that just goes to show that he just got passed along, and it didn't matter whether he knew how to read or not.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Carla.
Absolutely.
Wow. So yeah, we noticed that happens in terms of when we're looking at our students. Oftentimes, it's passed on to K through 12, right? And the blame is shifted to either the students or K through 12. But we don't ask why, right? We don't often ask why. And then we know that when we see or hear things like they hate to read, they work full time and they're not dedicated, this generation doesn't care. We also know that sometimes that's coded for certain students and what they look like and what communities they come from, right? So there's a judgment in there. So when we hear these labels, when we see, underserved or under this or the that we always use in our academy language, we know that that language is used so that we can get a picture of who these students are, right? But we also know that that's coded with a lot of other information. And so it's important to look at our language. How do we language our students? And how do we language one another in this? And where can we shift the language so that it's asset-based rather than deficit-based? And so when we're listening to our students or one another, when we're engaged in conversations, we know that we're bringing, those judgments, we're bringing that language with us. So what can we do in the moment to make sure that that's not what's driving the bus? What's the work that needs to be done personally to ensure that that's not what's driving the bus when we're engaging with one another? And again, I go back to, we say equity is for our students, and yes, it is. We've got these plans and these frameworks and all of this stuff that we're doing. But a lot of that oftentimes goes back to the institution looking outward and at times blaming outward instead of turning it around and saying, okay, let's look at us. And then drilling down to say, I'm a part of this academy, I'm a part of this institution. Let me look at me. What judgments, we know the history of education, right? We know all of the judgments and the setups. We know all of this as a part of this system, so to speak. And we know all of the racism that's embedded in our systems, right? We need to name it and call it out, call it what it is. So we know that every system has at its core, right, as part of a system with racism is there. All of the other isms, right, they're a part of it. Because these systems were not designed for us to be in and for certain students to be in. So that being said, understanding what the institution is, understanding that we all come with our own judgments, with our own prejudices, with our own biases, how can we move to allyship? And what does that look like for us? So that if the institution says that it is about equity and authentic communication and cultural humility and all of these other wonderful things, how are we demonstrating that in our daily practice as educators? Because that is going to determine the student experience, and that is also going to make the institution truthful, right? In the sense of it's doing and being what it says it is and what it's about. But that comes down to us because the buildings can't do it. It's the people who move the institution, who shape the institution. In our daily practice, instruction, student support, student services, administration, where are we and how are we showing up? So that we know we're doing our part to hold the institution in truth, but also accountable. And so you all having questions about, well, where do I see this? I hear that we're doing this, but I don't see it happening in my office. So the question becomes, how can you make it show up in your office? What is it that you can bring to the moment to ensure that these concepts, these theories, these principles, it's a part of your daily practice so that you're in alignment with the institution's goals, objectives, vision, mission, equity, framework. How are you doing this? I know I'm talking a lot. Any questions so far? Jump in, please, if you have any, because I feel like I'm just running. Any questions? Please let me know if I need to slow down. Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no, unless something's in the chat and I don't see it. Okay. Thank you for this, Monica. She says, there's certainly a power dynamic implied by language used or implied to students as though they serve or work for us rather than the contrary. Yes, totally agree with that. We have to be mindful of the power dynamics at place. Okay, so curious listening. How do we be more intentional? Knowing what we bring with us to each encounter, to each person we engage with. But how do we be compassionate, empathetic? How do we apply curious listening? So some steps here. Ignore your internal noise and thoughts. Listen to the other person's words and their impact on you. Sense how they are feeling. Remember what Maya Angelou said, because if you get a sense of how they're feeling, maybe you're going to shift your practice in the moment to make sure that they feel good when they leave you, right? Don't formulate a response in your mind. Don't think about advice, opinions, or solutions. Don't silently judge or criticize the person or what they are saying. Don't feel the need to memorize anything they say. Just be present to the moment and really listen. And I can provide you with more information around this. So one of the things that I wanted to do is to go back to this question, how do we know what's working? And even to take it a step deeper, how do we know that we're working, right? How are we bringing these qualities and these characteristics to the work that we do? And I think before we left last time, I asked you all, think about your positions, think about what you do, and consider how you bring equity into your work every day. As equity practitioners, I'm already calling you that because that's what your institution is about. So as far as I'm concerned, you're equity practitioners. So how do we deepen this work that we do? And what does that mean for you on a daily basis in your practice? So let's have a breakout session here and consider the question, how do you embody these principles, these characteristics, the things that you know about equity, the things that we've talked about, the mindfulness, right? How are you listening? Compassion, empathy. Think about these characteristics: authentic communication, cultural humility, power dynamics. Consider your colleagues and our students. And take some time in the breakout session to just talk about how are you bringing this to your work and what does it look like? Because the goal is to be able to demonstrate this, because we got to know what's working. And we can say we're about something all day long, but if there's no way to measure it, to demonstrate it, to evaluate it, as my law school professor used to say, you're spinning your wheels, Porter, you're spinning your wheels. So how do we do this? Let's look at the how, because I think that's important. And that's going to, again, help you to make sure you're in alignment with your institution's vision, goals, mission, right? All of that. But also, where's your heart in the work? And how can you demonstrate these characteristics in your daily work? So let's take about 20 minutes. Let's let the room decide. 15? Does that sound good? 20? What sounds best?